Oh my goodness, you are such an inspiration. Wow, you really are. You're so strong. Can I pet your service dog? Ugh. 1, 2, 3, let's go! We are artists, parents, teachers, good guys, bad guys, students, leaders. I'm not your inspiration, yeah, I'm fully who I am. Got my own expectations that don't fit into your plans. I'm not your sad story, so I wrote it in this song. Everything you know about disability is wrong. Yeah, everything you know. Yeah, everything you know about disability is wrong.
Hey listeners, welcome back to another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong. Today on the podcast, we are so excited to be joined by Lauren Melissa Elzy, also known across social media as Audie Nell. She's an autistic self-advocate, author, educator, and activist. Through writing and presenting, she highlights the inequitable systems that oppress queer, BIPOC, and disabled folks. Her young adult novels, Boy at the Window, Gimmicks and Glamour, and The Streamline, emphasize the importance of belonging for queer, neurodivergent youth of color.
And her work has crossed paths with Neuroplastic, New York University, Reframing Autism, Purple Media, Able Zine, Think Inclusive, the United Nations, and more. She holds an MS in Library and Information Science and resides in New York City. Welcome to the show.
We are so excited to have you. Thanks for being on, Lauren Melissa.
I'm really happy to be here.
That was an impressive bio. We were excited to get to read it. I love the long list. Before we get into the questions, let's go ahead and do our audio descriptions. This is Lily speaking. I am a white passing mixed race Indian woman with green eyes. My hair is pulled back today so you can see a small line of my pink highlight, but not much. And I'm wearing a black turtleneck and a gold necklace that I will fidget with throughout the episode. Erin, you want to go ahead and give yours?
Yep. I'm Erin. I am a white Latina with red hair, blue eyes, and I have a red shirt on, and I'm in my bedroom, sitting in my wheelchair. And I'll pass it to Lauren.
Hi, I'm Lauren Melissa. I am a Black multiracial woman with big curly hair and brown eyes. I'm wearing a light blue blouse with a sailor collar, and I am sitting in my room, and behind me is like a dresser and various pictures.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it.
So our podcast is Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong. And the first question that we asked everybody is, what do people get wrong about you?
Honestly, I think a lot of people get a lot of things wrong about me due to the multiple intersections of my identities. But in talking about disability, I think a big thing that a lot of people get wrong about me is that they would think that I am not disabled. So I think a lot of folks, when they talk to me or they interact with me, they don't recognize that I have multiple non-apparent disabilities until they notice them. But because of the assumptions that they make about me, when they do notice my various disabilities, be it my physical disabilities or my autism, they attribute them to really harsh judgments and assumptions. And so I would say that's a big thing that people get wrong about me. I mean, I've heard everything from she's a snob to she's a smart aleck, she's just for lack of a better word, like an airhead. So it's like, okay, which one are we gonna land on here? Or maybe that I'm lazy, or that I just want to stay home all the time, to she's a party girl. Like, I've heard everything, and it really just depends on people's judgments and what they see about me. But they'd never think that maybe I'm at home because my body is needing so much rest, or my brain, or maybe I'm not being a smart aleck. Maybe I'm just literally saying what I'm saying and they're reading into it, and that I just might communicate differently through my autistic neurotype. So I would say that's definitely something people get wrong about me a lot.
I deeply relate, and I think you just articulated a lot of what I've felt for a long time in words that I have not been able to find before. But yeah, I think that's I'm sorry you have to deal with those assumptions, because I know that the weight of that gets intense, and it feels like sometimes the assumptions seem to contradict each other. Like, I often get that I care too much and that I don't care at all about things. And I'm
Oh,
like,
yes,
well,
that's
what?
familiar.
Like, what do you mean? Like, and it's interesting. It's interesting. I like that you said that people tend to just go with really harsh judgment. And I've never really thought about that. Like, people don't have to, just because they don't understand differences doesn't mean they have to like immediately look for things that are wrong. Like, that's tough. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that the through line of the answer to that question from our guests often centers around assumption, just because of how little we talk about disability open in this world. And so people make a lot of assumptions. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think also it depends on what sphere I'm in. The offline world makes different assumptions of me, I'd say, than the online world, since I am very active on social media and I spend a lot of time in online communities. So while very rarely in the offline world do I get people accusing me of faking or lying about my disabilities, I do experience that more regularly in the online world. It's quite fascinating.
Maybe because that's just like a kind of awful thing to say to someone. So maybe people feel more comfortable being awful when they're behind a keyboard.
I also think it might have to do with the fact that they only see a very small snippet of me online, like through photos and short video clips. So it's really hard for them to really like actually know me at all.
That makes total sense. That's a good way to put it. I feel like, Erin, you've talked about that before, the difference between like communities online and reception of people.
Yeah, I get harassed, not a lot, but definitely more on the internet than in person. In person, I just get ignored, which is different. But honestly, I'd rather get ignored than harassed. But yeah, online spaces are definitely different and more toxic, I think, because everyone's not afraid to hold back. They just say whatever.
I agree. It can be more, I feel like it's interesting. Like in the offline world, things are like more the same in that level. Like you said, people ignoring you or people just like making assumptions about me based on my speech patterns. But then in the online world, there's like this massive pendulum of extreme toxicity and extreme acceptance. And you never know what you're going to log into.
Yeah, as you were saying that, Erin, I was thinking the exact same thing of what you just said, Lauren Melissa, that like it stinks that there's such little hubs of toxicity, because there really also are on the internet just like beautiful hubs of joy and understanding and like finally finding your people. It's definitely tough, and I respect people who create content on the internet and navigate through that. So speaking of, let's move into the section of the interview about all the cool stuff that you do.
Yeah, totally. So, as a writer myself, I'm really interested to learn about how did you get involved in writing, and who are some influential authors that inspired you?
Yeah, so I actually started writing as stories as soon as I could write. So that was starting in like the first grade and second grade when I learned how to not just like write, but like string things together. And so I remember my first stories were like about a mermaid. And then also my next story was like about a princess. It was a co-written story between me and my sister. It was about a princess who was kidnapped by a vampire, but her town was on fire, so she had to make sure she escaped. But already at that point, you can hear the fantastical elements, mermaids, vampires, and a huge part of my writing in general and what inspires me to write is actually my special interests. So my autistic special interests are Japanese visual kei rock, very specific, very awesome if you ever have time to look it up, and dark fairy worlds. And so even from that age, I was showing a lot of that interest in fairy worlds and just always wanting to write about fairies. And then as I continued to grow, I was listening to a lot of that specific kind of rock music. And even just like a single scene in a music video would cause me to want to write an entire short story. So it was this space, writing is this space where I can, for lack of a better term, info dump about my special interests in a way that nobody ever says, why are you still talking about that? And so I kind of like tricked everyone into listening to me talk about my special interests by having them read my newest chapter. And so that was very helpful for me. It was a great conduit of expression from a very young age and into middle school, high school, college, and now into today. But, you know, there were definitely authors who inspired me along the way and continue to inspire me. Holly Black is one of my favorite authors of all time. She writes about dark fairy worlds. I've been reading her stuff since since Tithe first came out. That was when I started reading Holly Black. And it's really awesome to see how many people are reading her things now. I'm like, yeah, like talk to me about it because this is my special interest. And then also I was very inspired by Francesca Lia Block and her lyrical, magical realism prose style of writing novels. It's very, very influential to my writing style and the way that I try to use imagery to evoke not just the visual, but also the emotional. And the third author that truly inspires me today is Banana Yoshimoto, who also writes magical realism. And she writes novelettes, and I'm just always shocked by how concise and precise she can be in naming the human experience through magical realism and by just exploring the mundane.
I'm like trying not to like lose my mind right now because I love all those authors.
Yay!
I have to know, what is your favorite Holly Black book?
My favorite Holly Black book, I would say it's probably either Valiant or I really did love The Cruel Prince. Like, I'm not gonna lie, like I'm the biggest fangirl of Carden ever.
Yes, I love that series. I read it for the first time last year, and I love it. It's so good.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, as soon as you started talking, I was like, oh, Erin's gonna be psyched. That's amazing. That was a phenomenal answer, and I just love the way you described that, the like giving yourself a space to info dump, because like one of my favorite things about autistic creatives, because I'm an autistic creative, so I feel like we find each other, and I have a lot of autistic creative friends, and it's always fun to see the way like we'll kind of get to know each other and be like, this is how my brain works. This is the dots my brain connects. And then it's like, oh, well, that makes sense that you do this thing now. And like my very best friend had the very stereotypical, she was obsessed with trains growing up. I always say she's got lucky. She got like the most famous autistic special interest. But now she works in public transit and like writes for a mass transit magazine. And it's so cool to see the way that she just dove into that special interest. And I write comedy because my brain is always like trying to make sense of human behavior, and to neurotypical people think that's kind of funny, so it just kind of like became comedy. But I never thought of it as a space where you can freely info dump. I love that, and I definitely do that in my comedy. When there's something I like can't stop talking about, I'll be like, well, I'll just write a bit about it, because then I can say the same thing many times. That's so cool. And I'm grateful that you turned your special interest into like great books. That's so cool. And I feel like there's some young autistic child who's really into like fairies and stuff that will now have your books to look to. It's exciting. And I think that there's something cool about autistic people creating media that then young autistic people find. I think it's like a beautiful cycle.
Totally.
I think one of my hopes is that in the young adult fiction that I write, it can either be a mirror for those who share the identities or a window for those who maybe have misconceptions or misunderstandings about neurodivergent folks, about queer folks, about multiracial protagonists. I usually have multiracial protagonists. And so it's just something that I try to put out there to be a mirror or a window.
That's so important. And I love that you bring the multiracial element into it as well. And like I know you have many intersecting identities, but coming from also a multiracial home, there's something in the autistic experience of like masking that then is so similar to the experience of code switching between like different family members. And I'm just like wishing I could have grown up with characters that could have like helped me understand that. And so excited that some of your readers will get to have that experience. That's just really cool.
Are there any characters that you grew up with, that you identified with, or related to as a child? And you already kind of talked about this, but why do you think it's important of having characters that young people can relate to in fiction?
So I actually didn't really grow up with very many characters in fiction or games or television that I identified with in terms of like being a autistic, queer, multiracial young person at the time. And I think that's one of the reasons why I so intently write about those intersections, because I really just, in terms of any of those things, a lot of the time, the publishing world will say, oh, you can write a multiracial character. Oh, you can write a queer character. Oh, you can write an autistic character. But if you start to combine, they're like, oh, it's too messy. Oh, it's too niche. And so I really want to make sure that I write about that niche, even if it doesn't reach as many like readers as possible, because there are people with those identities. I think it's very important to have characters that we relate to, just because I think a lot of times people think it's important because it's like, oh, when I read the book, then I'll see me. But it's not just about seeing me. A lot of the time when people read a book, they don't want to pick up a book about themselves exactly. They want to pick up a book so they don't have to deal with their life and escape in a healthy fashion. But I think when the protagonist shares those identities, we can escape into their worlds through them much more easily. So maybe a reader of my most recent novel, Streamline, doesn't play video games, doesn't stream online, but maybe because they are autistic or multiracial or queer, they can see themselves more readily in the protagonist and then access that fantasy world more easily. So I think that that's actually a really important reason. It's so that we can have that healthy escape that when maybe the going gets tough. I was the kid who was reading books in my closet so nobody would know that I was awake. I would read by candlelight at like 3 a.m. Because I couldn't sleep. I was so stressed out. I was sensory overloaded from school. I was experiencing so many social struggles and experiencing bullying because accepting differences wasn't really appreciated or promoted in the school. And so I found it very hard to sleep as a kid. I would stay up. I couldn't unwind. And reading was such a wonderful way for me to escape and also to grow in empathy towards other people. So I think that having access to diverse characters can only increase people's capacity to have empathy for other people and to learn to embrace differences. Now, I will say, there were lots of characters that I imitated as a kid, and I kind of like used them as personalities to be like a mask to try to camouflage my autistic traits. And some of them were from video games. I am a gamer, just like Loon and Streamline. But I actually would copy, for example, Riku from Final Fantasy X, to the point that I would always say, like, she had this one line where she would go 100%, and I would just constantly mimic that all the time. People would be like, "Are you ready? 100%." And like that was like my catchphrase at the time. So even if the character doesn't fully encompass who I am, I think I identified with Riku because she was different from other people and she was ostracized because of the way that she was just born. And I could connect with that immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. That scripting and like using a script is so relatable. I did very similar things, and sometimes when you just like are a child trying to fit into a neurotypical world, and then you quote like a odd movie, it just makes things worse. But I didn't know that as a kid, and
I'm not saying everybody was into the 100%. They were.
That's a good one though. I definitely had some like Disney Channel that was deep in my brain and would just come out. I'd just be quoting like Hannah Montana throughout the day. So speaking of Streamline, this is your first openly autistic protagonist. What made you decide to make that canon?
Well, honestly, each of my protagonists speak to me in like a different way, and I want to emphasize different parts of neurodiversity and neurodivergence through these characters. And I just knew right away that Loon was not only autistic, but that she already knew, and that she was combating stigma. And that was just an essential part of her character, that she was a gamer, that she lived so vividly in the online world, and that she just was most comfortable in her bedroom. And for some reason, this really bothers people. And that is something that she is having to fight for. And so I knew that right away about Loon, and I was excited to write my first openly autistic protagonist. I think I felt prepared because sometimes I had concerns that if I wrote an openly autistic protagonist, that one, everyone would assume that it was me. And two, that folks would become maybe upset and say, oh, this isn't representative of all autistics or of my experience of autism. But I think I just came to a place where I could write a story where Loon could express herself very well in the first person, to the point that no one would think, oh, this is what all autistics are like. I think she's aware of that herself in the way that she describes her autistic traits. So I don't think I was prepared to write like that, as responsibly as that before Streamline. But a lot of people ask me if the protagonists of Boy at the Window or Gimmicks and Glamour are autistic. Daniel in Boy at the Window has depersonalization, derealization differences, and maladaptive daydreaming is what they call it. And I don't really know if he's autistic or not. And I don't think that that's part of his journey and that story. I guess it's possible, but I never really thought of it that way. But it is great that so many autistic people identified with him. And then Ashley from Gimmicks and Glamour has sensory processing differences. But so that is very much co-occurring with autism. So perhaps she's autistic, but really I think she just wants to go hang out with fairies.
The difference between what I was assuming as like not a writer of like, oh yeah, because you as the writer know that your character's autistic, and the way you phrased it of the differences that she knows, that really clicked something into place for me. And I was like, oh, that makes total sense. And now I'm like, I love that you have a named autistic character and ones that just maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but diagnosis isn't something they've pursued, because that's like such a big part of the autistic experience, is that like deciding whether you find out or not. And some people don't even get to decide because we just don't know about things. And that's just, yeah, I really like the way you phrase that, because as a also late diagnosed person, there is a difference between, like, my autistic traits were always there, but the difference was whether or not I knew that it was because I was autistic or not. And that's just a great. You should be a writer. You're good at saying things.
I'll try. I'll keep that in mind.
Great.
And I know a lot of people listening to this may also want to be a writer too. So can you give us, our audience, some advice if you want to get published or get involved in publishing?
Yeah, definitely. I didn't do publishing in the traditional way. I am published through an independent publisher, which I think a lot of folks don't realize is an option. They think they have to use one of like the big publishers, or they have to self-publish. Like those are the only two options. But there is this whole other avenue of independent publishers where you still, have access to some resources, like some marketing resources, editors, and the like, different pieces like that. So when I actually wrote Boy at the Window, which was my debut novel, I had no plans of publishing. I had wanted to be published when I was younger, like especially when I was an undergrad. My major in undergrad was creative writing fiction. And so I definitely had huge plans to be a writer, but then, or a published author. I think you can be a writer without being a published author. And then I kind of like got discouraged. I think I was overwhelmed by, the big process, find an agent, this and that. And I had gotten a couple short stories published in various small magazines or online journals. But I got, really wrapped up in my career. I was going through a lot of personal growth. I was diagnosed with autism. And then during the shutdown that happened due to COVID-19, I stayed home a lot. And I was so tired of being on my computer all day. And I just felt like I was always on my phone or I was on my computer. And so I actually thought, why don't I write the story that's in my head, but I'll handwrite it.
Oh,
and
cool.
So then I can get some time away from my screen. And the person I was living with during that time, I would write a chapter and then read her a chapter every day out loud. And so she started being like, you better write a chapter today. You better write a chapter today. Because it was like her escape too. So in a little bit over a month, I wrote the entire novel. And I was like, that was fun. And then the friend that I had read it to was like, no, you need to get this published. And I was like, no, it's fine. She's like, no. And like, she's going to put her foot down about it. And I was like, okay, well, I'll do my research. I'll look for one independent publisher that I think is truly the best fit. So for those seeking publication, this is my path. Maybe this will be yours. I was like, I'm going to find one. I'm going to do my research, look at all of them. So I looked for an LGBTQ specific publishing house and I found Bold Strokes Books. And at that time, Bold Strokes Books was naming, this is very common, the lack of diversity that they had in their authors, because most authors are not people of color. Most published authors are not people of color because BIPOC books are not getting their work published. It's discrimination in a sense. So Bold Strokes Books was naming that there was maybe this unconscious bias in their publishing practices. And so at that time, they said, if you submit a manuscript and you are a person of color and we would publish it after reading it, you're guaranteed to get in. So I was like, okay, well, I'm going to give this a shot and I'll know if this is good at all by what happens here. So I sent it in and I was like, okay, goodbye. Wipe my hands of that. And then, well, lo and behold, they responded. So I would say definitely seek out a publishing house that really jives with who you are as a writer, and look for that connection and send a manuscript into them. I definitely recommend finishing a manuscript before seeking an agent, before sending in to a publishing house, not just for them, but also for you. Like, it's easy to not finish. So challenge yourself to finish first the novel and then send in.
That is great advice. I do have the issue of like never finishing. But this I'm working on a manuscript right now for a novel, and I do have that fear of like once I finish it, I will finish it. Once I do, I'm like, now what? So that's like great advice. Yeah.
Great advice, and I love the like fun accidental accountability buddy that built in there with reading it to your roommate. So, Erin, maybe that's like we need to put a weekly team meeting on our calendar where you read me your latest updates from your manuscript. That'd be really fun. Yeah, that's such a good idea. And honestly, like that was all phenomenal advice. And I hope that listeners, you mind like that piece of advice from it too, of that like getting someone else involved who then like pushes you to do something with it is like a really beautiful thing. And I think that's just so cool. And I'm glad you pursued that. Also, I was one of those people that thought that it was self-publishing or like the major houses. I didn't realize there were lots of independent places. What an interesting fact. Which is cool also because I feel like for people who are interested in going into publishing, like sometimes that feels like a kind of gate-kept industry because it's like, how do you get into these major houses without knowing people? But that's good to know that there's independent spaces to find. And I would hypothesize that it's in those independent spaces that if you are of any kind of marginalized identity, you'll be able to find more like ownership in yourself, I guess. I don't know if ownership's the right word, but like I appreciate, sometimes I feel like those larger mega publishing houses are the ones that are pushing those narratives of like, you can be one identity or the other, but we need to sell to a very wide audience. So one or the other. Whereas the independent might be where you can explore other things that wouldn't necessarily fly. I don't know if that's true though, because I've never been in publishing.
Definitely can't speak for every independent publishing house and whether or not that's the case. But I will say that for what I'm writing, which is just so niche in a sense, like I mentioned earlier, I think it can be easier, especially if you're a new author writing niche fiction, to see if you can find an independent publishing house that engages in that niche. And then you might have found your place.
I'm glad you said the word niche again, because I wanted to comment on that. What a wild thing to be told your identity is just very niche. Like, so wild. When I was acting a few years ago, that was a thing I would get told by like casting people, would be like, well, you kind of look pretty white, but you also don't look white. It's a little niche to cast. We're not exactly sure where to put you. And I was like, well, sorry, like that's just who I am. It's always kind of mind-boggling to me when people feel so comfortable like calling someone's identity something like that. Like it's just like, oh, okay. So I don't want to go to my next question yet, Erin. Actually, I don't want to skip over yours.
Oh, that's fine. So you do a lot of presentations on inequity and how queer, BIPOC, disabled people experience oppression. Can you share with us how you got involved in that and what that was like?
So I think the way I got involved in that was through my online presence on Instagram primarily. Originally, my Instagram, when I started it up in 2016, it was just supposed to be a place for me to connect in community with other autistic folks because I didn't really have a lot of community at that time. And it was also a place for me to sublimate some resentment that I had towards not receiving a diagnosis until my early 20s. actually being diagnosed in my early 20s isn't really that late for a lot of autistic women, because most autistic women aren't diagnosed until after the age of 18. So I think it's 80% aren't diagnosed at this time until after the age of 18. And so I was late for autistic people, but not necessarily that late for autistic women. But I still felt very like frustrated at the time. And one of the things that I was told was that I had developed a large number of coping strategies, and some of them were helpful and some of them were only helpful in terms of making it so that other people might not recognize my struggles as quickly, but they're actually harmful for me. And so I decided, in order to supplement this resentment that I had, I would create an Instagram where I would share the coping strategies that I had developed that I thought were more helpful. And maybe I thought, maybe there could be some autistic folks out there looking for ideas, and they've only got the coping strategies that are hurting them, or coping strategies that other people are forcing on them that aren't really helping them cope. And I was like, maybe this little tiny Instagram could help someone. And I thought, why not give it a shot? Fast forward, and it's completely like changed and transformed into a much bigger platform that I never imagined. And through that platform, I've talked about various elements of my identity as it intersects with autism, be it being queer or being Black and multiracial. And because of that, I have had various organizations reach out to me and ask, oh, hey, would you want to be a speaker at this conference? Or would you want to work with us behind the scenes as a consultant? And I'd actually say that my intersections of identity have been very advantageous in terms of how much I can support specific organizations, because if you just have an autistic person who's white and a boy, you might, and straight, then you might miss a lot of experiences that happen when you have compounding marginalization. So a lot of my presentations have covered a variety of topics. I'll say the most common topic that I've ever talked about is definitely around sensory overstimulation, stimming, embracing stimming, understanding one's sensory needs. But I do have various events where I've gone and talked about intersectionality and talked about largely about race and autism, or queerness and autism. And that's been really great, because I usually have folks in the audience, be it the virtual audience or in-person audience, who have come up to me afterward and said, it's the first time I've actually ever met or spoken to another autistic person who is also identity here, and that was very helpful for them, because that's their identity. And so I think it is really important just to go out and talk to folks. And I think there is still autism awareness work that we need to do in order to achieve autism acceptance, hopefully someday.
I totally agree with that last statement on I think it's really great that in a lot of advocacy movements, we are kind of moving away from awareness and into like more, acceptance territory. But like what people are aware of when it comes to being autistic is so like one subtype of autistic people. So I do think that that's really important. And I appreciate you saying that. For Autistic Acceptance Month in April for Easter Seals, I was really grateful because they really let me take the lead on like, what content do you want us to help you make so that you can, help our audiences learn more? And I was like, well, I would love to get to autistic acceptance, but we don't even have autistic understanding right now. People don't know what traits look like. So we made a series about understanding what autistic traits are like and interviewed lots of different autistic people from different backgrounds. And it was really enlightening to see the difference between what an Indian man stimming was like versus a Black woman versus a white man versus like these things do affect us. And I think that, yeah, we need more awareness of that, especially because you brought up the late diagnosis. I'm very similar, and I also dealt with the had a lot of resentment of feeling like I was so like late diagnosed, but now I know more and I'm like, well, early 20s is unfortunately actually quite early. And but it does feel like it feels so late, and I definitely had a lot of those unhealthy, and healthy is a moralistic word, but maybe not as helpful coping strategies. Other than coping strategies, were there any other ways that not really understanding your brain until your early 20s kind of left a lasting impact on you? And I also wonder if you have anything to say to women out there who might share some of your identities, who might be thinking they're autistic but don't feel like they fit the mold of what they've stereotypically heard about autism.
Definitely. So I would say one of the many lasting impacts of not learning about my autistic identity and specificity until my early 20s was the way it really impacted the way that I see myself. In this, I think I've gotten a bit better about this, but see myself in relation to other people. I did actually suspect that I am autistic when I was 13 years old. So I had some idea about it pretty early on, thanks to the good old internet. But I had this kind of like understanding of the way I was situated in the world, in that all of the social difficulties I encountered, the social challenges, the bullying that I experienced, the loss of friends on like a constant revolving, what is that called? Like a belt? No, it's a conveyor belt.
Conveyor belt, yeah.
I thought that it was always my fault and that I was inherently broken. And so the way that impacted me in adulthood, and still impacts me, I have to like talk myself down a lot of the time, is I have a tendency to blame myself for everything. So that can be big, as in like someone's yelling at me. I would think it's my fault, I need to change. Or someone looks tired, I would assume it's my fault. I'm boring them, because I was always so socially confused and people were somehow always telling me it was my fault when something went wrong. My brain decided to just assume the absolute worst about everything that I encountered that was confusing. And that worst case scenario was that it was my fault and I needed to change myself or fix it. And so I would say that was one of the big lasting impacts of this late diagnosis, of this not knowing myself. But, I'm going to be honest, I don't know if that's actually just an issue that late diagnosed folks experience, because I do think that autistic individuals who are diagnosed at an earlier age are still often fed a message, whether or not it's stated outright or it's an undercurrent of the therapies and the quote unquote supports and services that they're receiving, that it's you, fix it. And that has a long lasting impact, especially when therapy is focused only on social skills and not on social context. It's really important to explain context and not just say, do this differently, do that differently, but just to explain what's going on in full detail, because many autistic people like detail when we're confused. And I think that's a long lasting impact of attributing all of these challenges to the autistic person. This medical model of disability is that we'll just grow up to blame ourselves, or we'll grow up to completely reject society entirely. Which, hey, sometimes you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah.
I know there was a second half to this question and I can't remember it right now.
Well, I have so much I want to say on that, so we'll get to the second half of it. But yeah, I think there's a sort of learned codependence that happens with when like I just started kind of learning about codependence. It's not what I thought it was, but that feeling of like I always assumed codependence was about like being too like attached to people but more codependence in the term of like thinking that you are in charge of other people's emotions. And I definitely felt that. Like I felt growing up that like there was something innately wrong with me where I was such a strong presence that if everyone in the room was sad, it had to be because of me. And you're right. I like that you point that out, that I think that either way, when we're focusing on social skills, whether you have undiagnosed kids or diagnosed kids, it's the same kind of experience of like, this is falling on you. And just shoving this like innate ability to ask, well, how's my well-being in this? I think I always wonder if that is something that's like, is it that is an autistic trait in itself of the like not necessarily reading your own cues, or is that a experience of the trauma of constantly being like feeling like you're to blame for what's going wrong, which is kind of a chicken or the egg situation. I don't know if we'll ever figure it out, but I think that that's an important point you brought up, that it goes both ways for diagnosed and undiagnosed people when we focus on social skills versus context and like well-being. You brought up earlier, you said that that you like sometimes you just want to be in your room because it's your favorite spot, but it seems to really bother other people. And I think that until I
said Loon thought that.
Oh, okay.
There you go. People say
I did it. I did the thing. Because I relate to that.
I also
so
relate
hard
to
on that.
I do too.
Of like, but for so long before I would let myself enjoy that, I would like, I was forcing myself to go out and be social and do these things, even though I didn't like them, because I felt like I wasn't allowed to enjoy what I like to enjoy because it didn't fit the social model. So it would like make other people feel bad. And I think I don't know if I have anything to say other than just, I so agree on that. And the second part of the question was, do you have anything to say to undiagnosed women out there who might be thinking they're autistic, but don't feel like they like are dealing with that question and maybe feel like they don't have the space to like explore that identity?
I think that this is probably not going to be the advice people expect, but I would say maybe like pause if you are that woman. Pause and turn off social media for a little bit, because it's like so overstimulating and there's so many different voices and so many different experiences, and like it's like a never ending pattern and match game. And like look for a book written by an autistic woman and see how you feel after reading that book. And there's audiobooks too, if that's more accessible, or just like, honestly, when it comes to nonfiction, I always like reading like audiobooks and I like reading print books for fiction. But anyway, I would say read a whole book, because that puts the entire picture together a lot better than bits and pieces on social media only. Now I literally make content on social media, so I'm not telling you to stop reading social media content, but I would suggest reading a whole book or two if you are that person, because that's what really helped me to feel grounded when I finally did decide to pursue an evaluation. It was after reading multiple books about it.
I think that's phenomenal advice.
And it's something that the author would say, read a book.
That's funny. Speaking of your social media posts, you have a post that really spoke to me about unmasking and the process of unmasking and how it can come with losing some friends. What was your experience like with that? And just, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts about unmasking and losing friends. So, this is a common occurrence for autistic folks who are accustomed to changing our personalities to meet the social expectations around us. And so one way that I tried to cope was kind of by mimicking the people I was talking to. And it wasn't that I would actually like change myself. It was that I would become like a mimicker and a parrot in a way of just being like, I like that too. I am going to be doing that too. Let's do that since you like that. And people are like, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? Kind of thing. And then I would also try to just say whatever it is I thought other people wanted me to say versus what I actually felt or really wanted for myself. Now, when I start to unmask that and start to show more of what I want, what I'm interested in, what I want to do, my friends weren't accustomed to that. And it's not that those people are bad people, because they actually got to know me as a different person. So I like to clarify that it's not like they were bad friends. Like, let's take some perspective here. If your friend just like turns around as a completely different person on you and they say things differently and they have different interests that you're not used to and they talk about things differently, it's going to be really jarring. Like, that's got to be weird. And they're probably like, what happened to my friend? That's not my friend anymore. And so I lost some friends, but in a way, I didn't actually lose any friends, because the truth was we were never friends. And not in like they were a bad person. They were never really my friend, but we were never actually interacting as friends. It was almost like a puppet show was happening. And I decided to stop playing the show. And that's going to then mean that I'm becoming the full protagonist in my life. And that protagonist needs to make friends. And some of those people will be the people that I had made friends with before. And they are like, actually, this new you is cool too. And some of them will be like, oh no, actually, that's not the kind of person I would normally be friends with. And that's their choice, just like it's my choice to step away from them. And so that's my perspective on unmasking and losing friends. Now, does it hurt still? Of course. Of course it still hurts. But having perspective that sees it a little bit more holistically and long term, I think can make it easier to make that full decision to step into myself and to find the community that works best for who I truly am.
I think that's a really beautiful answer. And
oh, and one more thing is we might discover that we actually don't want that many friends. Because that's
Melissa,
also a big thing.
That's literally what I was going to add. Yes, in relating to Loon and wanting to be in her room, I had to realize that I actually didn't like love socializing with people that much, and I ended up really paring back. And for a long time I had a lot of anger towards those friendships that didn't work out, and because I felt like, well, they don't like my authentic me. And it took a couple years to get to that place where you're at now, that feeling of like, well, they never knew authentic me. That wasn't the person they signed on to be friends with, and kind of giving that grace. Well, still, yeah, it still hurts. But that realization, and then also the realization of that, like, I had like some friend groups, especially when I was in college and really high masking, where I, every time I would hang out, I would leave just thinking like, did I say the right thing? I'm so stressed. I feel like I was weird in there, and just feeling terrible. And it took me so long to understand that the way I needed to read that feeling was not that I am a terrible person and that I need to change to get these people to like me, but that it's seems like maybe I don't like being around these people, actually, because every time I'm around them, I feel really terrible about myself. And learning that I think that comes with going back to our conversation about, when you're autistic, how that changes things. Like that feeling of understanding, like, oh, my discomfort should not be the norm. Actually, I can prioritize a life of comfort, even if it doesn't look like what I expected. Beautiful answer. I really appreciate everything you've said today. We are over time. I could talk to you forever. I have one last question, which is autistic meltdowns are often, you've worked in schools a lot, and autistic meltdowns are often seen as temper tantrums. I've seen you have some amazing content for people. If you want to learn more about meltdowns, you should follow her. And that the way that they're often seen as temper tantrums. I'm wondering what you think teachers of autistic students should know to best support their autistic students who might have meltdowns or other sensory needs that can cause challenges in the classroom.
Yeah, definitely. So I used to experience meltdowns 2 to 3 times a week. I now experience them 2 to 3 times a year. And the reason for that is because I actively work on finding out what my triggers, my sensitivities are, my needs, sensory wise and socially. And I've stopped thinking about it as stopping meltdowns. And I've started thinking about it as stopping overstimulation, supporting social confusion, actually looking at what the triggers are, and then working towards supporting those triggers from not being triggered and preventing those things or proactively supporting those things. So instead of thinking about meltdowns, once a meltdown starts, it's not going to stop. Unless it turns into a shutdown. That's just what has often happened for the majority of autistic folks when we experience meltdowns. So if you have a student who experiences meltdowns, prioritize safety when they're in a meltdown. Prioritize the safety of the other students and that student. So that could mean evacuating the other students from the room if that student is unable to leave the room at that time. If the student who's having the meltdown is able to leave, then helping them leave the room. That's the most ideal, but let's not shove a student out of the room, right? We can actually evacuate the other students. Yeah. That's also possible. But in truth, it happens before. The support happens far before the meltdown. I think it's Dr. Brenda Smith-Miles who created the rage cycle and talks about the rumbling stage. And that rumbling stage and identifying what causes the rumbles is so important. If I'm in a room with fluorescent lighting, I'm more likely to have a meltdown. So are we going to try to stop the meltdowns, or are we going to change the lighting? If I am in a loud environment and experiencing brand new curriculum, brand new ideas all at the same time, I'm more likely to have a meltdown. So how about we help the environment be quieter when we're experiencing new curriculum? How about we prime for new challenging tasks instead of thinking about how do we stop the meltdown? And also, I know this is going to sound really strange, but if an adult is walking on eggshells around a child, and child means through the teen years in this context, that child knows. And that emotional tension can be a meltdown trigger. So take care of yourself too, educators, and make sure that you're in a place where you can co-regulate. Because if you're unable to co-regulate, then you and the child are going to be setting each other off, and that's going to be fireworks in the bad way. So that's a quick little hey, here's some ideas. But, of course, it's much, much more complicated than that. But I would say stop thinking about the meltdowns as something to stop and start thinking about the triggers as something to support.
Well, that was phenomenal advice for my 27-year-old self. So I imagine it's going to be very helpful advice for lots of other people. I think it is. Thank you for sharing that you went from 2 to 3 meltdowns a week to these a year. That's like a beautiful transformation. And I really appreciate the way you broke that down, how you got there, because I think that it can feel a little hopeless sometimes. And I think that that can come from the blaming the meltdown as the thing and not the triggers that cause it. This has been such a wonderful interview. Thank you so much for coming on our show and chatting with us. This has been so fun.
Yeah, it's been great. I've had an awesome time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I love meeting fellow book nerds. So
Yes. I can't believe I was so glad when you started talking to me about Holly Black. That's like, yes.
Well, stay tuned. So maybe you'll be able to read one of Erin's books. That's going to be great. Thank you so much for being on the show. Erin, thank you for hosting with me. I adore you. And listeners, thanks. And listeners, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time on another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong.
If you liked what you heard, go ahead and subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you to our listeners, and as always, thank you to Easter Seals for giving us the space and resources to share such authentic conversations from within the disability community to our listeners.
And we'll see you next time for another episode of Everything You Know About Disability is Wrong.
Everything you know about disability is wrong.
This is a podcast brought to you by Easter Seals.
You know, we actually work for Easter Seals, but maybe our listeners don't know what we do.
That's true. Easter Seals is leading the way to full access, equity, and inclusion for disabled people and their families.
And did you know we've been doing this for more than a century?
This includes helping disabled people find meaningful employment and addressing healthcare needs for all ages.
We're proud to serve communities across the country and ready for the next 100 years. For more, check out easterseals.com.